Kant Sellars Conference, Day 3, Session 2.
Mit manchen Sachen
Du wurdest also Moderation die Runde machen im Netz über YouTube Hit werden. So diese Phase, in der man dich überhaupt nicht hört, andere außer dir. Und dann wird immer die Frage gestellt werden, war die Moderatorin eingeschlafen, gegangen? Das wird ein Hit, ein Meme, wie man das im Internet nennt. Stefan, das hast du ungefähr vorgestellt, so als Antwort. Es scheint aber nicht zu sein. Und online
we've actually joined an aircraft come up every time. Put down two of those things.
Nothing else to say.
I just wonder how uncomfortable the quality is. Yeah, it's really much
First, very happy to do it. And then, okay, now we have this moment.
I'm trying to think about having this wrong.
Well, I was thinking of not even as draft. Not for
you didn't steal any of my words, just don't tell them mine. Even if you don't mind.
why are you asking me? It says not for attribution. I haven't authorized this particular strong check.
Even more sharp. You can't tell me I have to ignore yours.
Okay, I think we should start this session, to which I would like to welcome you. In this second session today, we will deal with a paper written by deVries. Hello, Bill. on presence of space and time and experience. I guess you would like to start with some introductory
Yeah,
remarks?
just a couple of short things. You'll notice the paper was very short. This is because it wasn't intended to answer anything. It was intended to incite discussion. And to those of you who are here on Friday, I think some of it will seem like a probably familiar discussion. I'm sure we'll be rehashing some of the things that were just brooded about in the first session on Friday on Mrs. paper. I do apologize for the self-citations. I hate it when people do that, but I found, since I was trying to be quick, I did it too much myself. I find, I guess the basic points are that I find what I have called Sellars' phenomenological perceptual principle, this idea that when you ostensibly see something that is red and rectangular, then somehow something red and rectangular, or something somehow red and rectangular in physical space is present before you, or present to you, I guess, other than is believed in. I find that sort of intuitively compelling, but I'm also embarrassed to say that I struggle to find some way to defend it other than saying, well, I find it intuitively compelling, which is not a really strong defense, particularly since I actually don't think that intuition in the sense of the, sort of insight into the truth is a viable philosophical method. So one of the things I'm hoping is that someone will say something that'll spur me to either have a better idea why I believe it or find it intuitive, or maybe convince me that it isn't. And then I also spend some time looking at John's alternative view of how space and time show up in our experience, because he claims to dispense with Sellars' two-aspect or two-part view of perception, and I've always struggled to try and understand how John's suggestion is really going to work. So I'm hoping to get some enlightenment there as well, and so that's what I'm trying to incite a discussion on. So I'm going to stop.
Good. Before I'm asking for hands, would you like to respond somewhat directly, or would you open the discussion?
Okay, I'm torn. I'd say one really simple, and I hope quite quick thing. Somewhere around the middle of the paper, Bill, you protest against my saying that for Sellars, sensations are exhaustively characterizable without reference to blah, 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 blah. And you perfectly rightly say there's a whole lot more that you can say about sensations according to Sellars. Maybe this is too quick, but maybe I'm not entitled to it, but what I want to say is all I meant was for Sellars, sensations do not have characterizations of their intrinsic nature that use intentional notions. So all I meant to be getting at was the point that Sellars is getting at when he, a thought that Sellars is getting at, whether it's a point is another question, when he says in locutions such as sensation of red,
Right.
you need to be really careful about what that of is doing. What it isn't doing is anything like what of is doing in locutions like thought of a celestial city, where that does introduce. And I'm sorry about the exhaustively characterizable, etc. That was meant to put in place a distinctively Sellarsian reading of how to think of sensations as characterizable in the way Kant characterizes them, and modifications of the subject state, which I
recognize that one.
Yeah.
I guess what I was worried about was that you were trying to emphasize that they're mere abstractions. They're not really suitable for, as Sellars thinks ultimately they could be, treatment in a scientific theory, develop a theory about what sensations are in us and how they fit into the rest of the physical reality. And I was afraid that you were trying to exclude that, fairly early on by that characterization.
Yeah, but I'm not rejecting the idea that our sensory experience has a sensory aspect.
Okay.
If you like,
Right.
two aspects. You said that in the introductory remarks, a sensory aspect and an intentionality involving aspect. What I'm querying is the thought that these two aspects have to come apart in the kind of way. Sure,
Right.
there's a topic for scientific investigation if you want to go in for this kind of science. The sensory aspect of our, for instance, color experience.
Okay.
But what our color experience is experience of color, and now that's intentionality, the intentionality involving of, or seemingly. So if I can say one more thing, about the I forget what you call the principle, but the thing that gets you there somehow in some way.
Right.
What always strikes me about Sellars' introduction of that kind of locution, which he thinks is needed for talking about a topic that you can put in place using the word ostensibly, or ostensible, or ostensible perceivings. The sensory aspect of ostensible perceivings has to be captured like that. It always seems to me that he's not appreciating the power of a concept that he himself makes a lot of fuss about and it says illuminating things about, the concept of seeming. Right? So an ostensible perceiving is either a perceiving, an actual perceiving, or a seeming perceiving. And starting there, you can get that the only kind of presence of sensibles to subjects needed for accommodating ostensible perceivings is cases of actual presence of sensibles in conceptually informed experience, or seeming cases of that, seeming cases of presence to conceptually informed experience. There doesn't need to be an actual presence. In the case of the merely seeming perceptual presence, that's.
Yeah, I guess I think I do know that's where you want to go, and I guess that word "seems" can move around.
It's kind of his concept. That's the.
Well, yeah, but where it goes makes a difference, and
yeah.
Sure, I guess I do believe that in a seeming perception, an ostensible perception, it's one in which, as it were, it's at least possible that from my side, I can't, if I'm having it, I can't tell the difference. So that it's not a seeming perception, as it were, as it seems to me, right? It is a perception to me which turns out to be merely a seeming, and how do you account for its indistinguishability from a veridical perception? And that's why I find that the idea that there's something somehow like the perceivable present to me, that seems to me a reasonable way to approach it.
Good. Any hands? Okay, Johannes first.
Well, I hate to go back to that, but it feels like you made me, Bill.
What can I say?
One thing here is that I think the ostensible here is a bit of a red herring with respect to the something somehow in Cuban physical space and so on. Because this something somehow should be there even in the non-ostensible case. And I do not see that the ostensibility or the seeming is doing any work here. It is doing work, not for this phenomenological fact. It is doing work for the further step to say, oh, the very same thing that has been there in veridical perception seems to be already there as well in the case of non-veridical perception, i.e. the
seems to be there.
That is probably the main. Would be one. I mean, as I said, this is the direction of the question here is the direction of the argument. Do you start with this as a phenomenological fact, or do you end up with that in always reading the ostensible already in the sentence, in the formulation, and hence connecting it to the conclusion of the sense impression inference? And it can do only work in. It can only do the work it is supposed to do in Sellars, I think, if one gets a weak reading of the ostensibility in this case, get thrown out and say, okay, even in the veridical case, something somehow other is believed in. Of course, in the veridical case, it could very well be the properties of macroscopical physical objects in physical space. No doubt about that. Nobody tries to say that's different. But still, even then, you would have this very fact, which he takes to be a phenomenological fact, that something somehow other than believed in, as merely believed in, is there, and so on and so on. So I don't really see that the seeming question at this point of the argument enters into the considerations, and I would yet have to be convinced that it does.
Okay, right. So put slightly differently, the point is that, look, he still believes that even in a vertical perception, of course, there is something somehow red and rectangular present to me other than is believed in, and that's, for him, the difference between a merely thinking of a red rectangle and a perceiving of a red rectangle.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's true.
I think that makes a difference for John's reply, but I may be mistaken here.
Other than as merely believed in figures in some of these formulations, but I think that's kind of inept anyway. What he's driving at is, I would say, otherwise than as figuring in a specification of the intentional object of what we're talking about, which is an experience. And I think you really need the mere seeming case in order to make it look compulsory to bring that in. I mean, if we forget about the fact that you can merely seem to perceive something red and just focus on, say, a case of actually perceiving something, but perceiving it to be red, right? A case of redness is present to the perceiver in the experience. So far as we've got so far, the only presence that you could so much as seem to need is a presence that is captured by saying, the word red figures in a specification of the intentional content of this experiencing. There's no need to bring in another mode of presence of red yet. There seems to be a need to bring in another mode of presence. Once we move to merely seeming perceivings of something red, and then insist that there's got to be something actually, a case of actual presence in common between that and the case of perceiving and merely seeming to perceive. As Bill says, I mean, in order to account for the possibility of taking a seeming perceiving to be a perceiving, which of course that's in there with the idea of seeming. So I don't think it's right that ostensible is doing no work in what makes this seem right. If we didn't have to think about merely seeming perceivings of red, then it would be there wouldn't be any ground for saying. Well, Bill thinks there's ground, but I don't think there would be any ground for saying we need another presence.
I'm worried about
over
that.
and above a presence for thought. Sellars' allusion to scholastic ways of thinking.
Intentional content
So
is not
that's-
merely linguistic content. Not merely. You have this. You just made this by. I would share the premise that there is
content, as in Sellars' own line in EPM. Experiences, as it were, make claims.
But look, I mean, he's also got the line in EPM where he, it's almost a throwaway mark, but he says that the real test of a theory of thinking is its theory of thinking in presence. Because, thinking in absence has always got challenges. How do you, think about something when it isn't anywhere in the neighborhood, and blah, blah, blah. But I take it that one of the lessons there is, and this is what I'm afraid you're falling into, is that when you're focusing solely on thinking in presence, you're letting the mere presence itself do a lot of the work. That in fact ultimately makes it impossible to sort of project your theory on into absence thinking as well. And I'm worried that
I don't want to stop with
well, so when you think about thinking,
but that's the the issue comes up once we've got the class of things that we're thinking about specified as ostensible perceivings, which include both perceivings and merely seeming perceivings. It's quite right that we need to register that there is that kind that we can place experiences in ostensible perceivings. Let's say ostensible perceivings of red, just keep it. And then the whole question is whether the move from thinking about perceivings to moving to thinking about a kind of thing that includes them and also includes merely seeming perceivings requires a new mode of presence in our picture, as opposed to that mode of presence that was already in the picture when we weren't yet thinking like this, and then seeming cases of that. Right. So where Sellars says there's got to be an actual presence of redness, why not say what there is a seeming? I mean, in the case where there's no actual presence for thought, what there is a seeming presence for thought. Seeming does the work. That he, yeah. And
there are two fingers, Jim and Mark.
Well, what I was going to say has, I think, been said by John very clearly. But on the other hand, it's
go ahead.
It's not clear, that there's any agreement about this. Maybe it's worth trying to say again. I mean, you even said it in kind of the way I would say, but
so go ahead and be redundant.
I'll be redundant. I mean, but maybe just doing it very briefly because that would be helpful. I mean, in veridical sensory consciousness, there is something that is present to us. We have presence to sense, a sensory consciousness of an object. And it seems like an unpacking of that idea, sensory consciousness of an object, is going to have both an intentional and a sensory aspect, to use John's word. We're not going to have our topic unless it has both of those aspects. And then for various purposes, we can focus on one or the other, abstract way, or consider about certain funny cases. But it does seem like as long as we're thinking about veridical sensory consciousness of an aspect of an object, there's one notion of presence there that has two aspects. And unless we somehow create a category that works the way ostensible seeing works in Sellars, which I take to be different than merely ostensible. Category of ostensible seeing, is supposed to be inclusive and include those cases in something else. I don't see any way, till we expand in that way, to even have, the appearance of an obligation to not just distinguish two different aspects of such presence, but to have two different modes of presence which are now distributed over each of those aspects. Seems like what pushes you to say that is to say something that there's not just something generically in common between the veridical and the non-veridical case, but you want to say there is a thing present, even though the thing that your thought was intentionally picking out isn't there anymore, which is present in both cases. And so now we have a mode of presence, which is common to the two cases, the hallucination, the veridical perception. And that does seem to me to involve some dubious thinking, if that's the way it's going. But we could say if it involves dubious thinking or not. But I do think this is, I was coming where Johannes first said, if we don't have that widened category, if we are just considering the veridical case, then I don't really see how, just considering that case, there's any intellectual pressure to move from two aspects of the mode of presence to a mode of presence for each aspect. It seems like we need the expanded category. And so in this sense, I'm agreeing with Bill that he needs to be considering that wider class to even have the pressure to move to that claim. I have my worries about how that works, but I think you're right that we need that.
Bill just gave us another aspect. He said he contrasted thinking of presence and thinking of absence. And why is not to distinguish the aspect in question enough? Why is it not enough to distinguish this something somehow aesthetic, to distinguish those two cases? You don't need the seeming case for it. You need those two cases, and already you have what you want. An innocent phenomenological fact. Why do you not have it there? Because you have thinking with a sensible aspect, and you have thinking without a sensible aspect.
I don't think that shows that there's a different mode of presence.
Well, but here, try this one.
An aspect, maybe.
Why does it not show a different mode of presence, right? I mean, take contrast. I see the cup from, remember Terminator 1, where various things would happen, and he'd get little lines of text in front of him. So imagine somehow the cup bangs into me, and I get a line of text. There's a cup on the table. That's really bloody different. The cup is present to me differently there if it's just giving me a line of text that I understand in as many way as you want. That seems to me perfectly sufficient. That does just as much, because it precisely, you're saying that the non-veridical case.
I'm not saying we can't give sense to the phrase different mode of presence. That's not the idea of a merely sensory mode of presence that's been completely shorn of an intellectual aspect. That's what we need for these particular. That is still, to use Kant's language, something that's going to fall in the realm of a possible objective experience. And as long as it's a possible objective experience, it's going to involve both of these aspects.
Johannes' claim was that the difference, that the not merely as the object of belief, presence as not merely the object of belief, was a separate thing, and that you didn't need to talk about ostensible cases to get that idea. And it seems to me completely. I'm just missing something.
Which idea? The idea we're trying to get is the idea of a mode of presence which is merely sensory.
All right, can I make a suggestion?
Well, you've changed your suggestion.
May I make? I'm going to. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to make a suggestion. We've been treating the word seems as if it is sort of univocal everywhere, but it seems to me that in fact there may be two different senses here, and maybe that's part of the idea. After all, we can say things like, it seems to me the Red Sox are going to win this series next year as well. Right? Now, that can be a perfectly good seeming, but of course it's not a perceptual seeming at all. And so I was thinking, take the case where you're looking at something that's a familiar illusion, like the Muller liar, right? On the one hand, it makes good sense to say, well, it seems to me that the lines are different, have different lengths. On the other hand, it can also make sense to say, well, it seems to me that in fact, someone asks you, it seems to me that they're the same length. I know this trick. You've been pulling this on me before, and they're the same damn length. And now, it seems to me sensorially that they're different, but I believe, assuming that you're not trying to subtly trick me, so I'm not going to fully endorse it, that in fact they're the same length. It seems to me you can say it seems to me that they're the same length, and it seems to me that they're not the same length, with a slightly different twist on the seeming there, and that makes sense, because the one seeming is a straightforward withholding of endorsement from a purely declarative claim, and the other seeming is a sensory seeming. And it's a different, and then that makes sense only because there are two different ways in which these things can seem to me.
That's a misuse of English, I think, Bill. I don't think I think when you're in on
Can we take a poll on that?
well, let me just offer you. When you're in on the trick, a much more natural locution is, it looks as if and continues to look as if, but it no longer seems to me that. And I think seems has a judgmental implication that looks as if is much more the sensory, I think, if you were to speak exactly. John is
good. Yeah.
Nothing. This Oxonian point which probably says something about that.
Conferences in America, damn it.
I didn't say it just when you know it isn't.
We could do what we want with that one.
It is. I suppose it looks to me as
I
if
want
it
to
is.
join in on accusing Bill of not being able to speak his native tongue. Where I think this is going is something.
No, I can't speak your native tongue.
We should be thinking about the section of EPM called the logic of looks.
Yes, exactly.
And in what we've got there is to begin with an image, a metaphor. Visual experiences, as it were, make claims, and that's it's got to be cashed out, the metaphor, but that's the core of the account of how to understand looks claims. Looks claims, right? Looks claims describe experiencings in terms of the claims that they, the experiencings, as it were, make. And in the Müller-Lyer, you have a visual experience that, as it were, makes the claim these lines are of unequal lengths, and you know better than to accept the experience, as it were, tells you, purports to tell you these lines are of unequal length.
And that's the point Sellars makes about
you know not to get told.
But as an experience.
That's a context in which to place an understanding of. You're right. Start with thinking in presence. Veridical doesn't do it, right? Because the good cases are cases where experience gives you to know that things are the way it, as it were, claims they are. And just things being that way isn't enough for experience to give you to know that.
Yeah.
Start with cases where experience gives you to know that things are, as it were, claims that they are. There's a base case of visual presence to a subject of experiencing of sensibles, which sensibles, well, depends on what the experience is described as it were, claiming. That gives you the base case. That is not presence otherwise than... I mean, the locutions are unhappy, but what they are obviously getting at is otherwise than as part of the content. But this presence is not presence otherwise than as part of the content. It's presence as part of what you spell out in saying what it is that the experience, as it were, claims.
But I think there's a fairly clear-cut response to that.
Experience are not merely claims. Experience are claims that make, as it were, claims, and that's the important lesson to be drawn from. But they are not mere claims, and that's all.
No, because they're experiences, and then they also have a sensory, right? It wouldn't be an experience unless it was in a sensory way that it was making this claim. Jim's talk of...
In a sensory way, yeah. So why could I not sort of... I mean, all there is it possible to concentrate in the required sense on this sensory aspect maybe, or a sensory way, or a specific kind of sensory making a claim, as opposed to making it in the terminator way.
Your response...
And if I have that, why is that not enough? It is not enough, certainly not, for the sense impression inference. Certainly not. No, I didn't claim that.
What you're calling the sense impression.
Yeah, what I'm okay.
That's the inference to this, the thing that Bill is calling the whatever it is principle.
Yeah, I know.
The problem I have with it is that your response seemed to assume that we should treat all seams and appearance words in general on the model of the logic of looks in EPM.
Right.
But Sellars does say in Structure of Knowledge, I forget exactly I think it's the first lecture, that he grants to Chisholm that we do have a non-comparative use of appearance words. And in my little story about the Muller liar, they seem to be different lengths. I would say that's actually a non-comparative use of or they appear to be different lengths. That would be a non-comparative use and not one of these endorsement holding ones, at least not directly, so that they're actually the admission of the non-comparative use of appearances turns out to be important for him for maintaining the distinction between these two different modes of presence, because there are two different ways in which things can seem in those modes of presence. So that's...
The genus is just backing off, and there's lots of ways you can back off the full perceptual judgment case.
I'm not sure the non-comparative uses are backing off.
I don't believe that. The genus is cases where Sellars' story about the logic of looks fits. Not any old backing off from endorsing some claim counts. The cases that we should be focusing on
Counts
are
as
cases
what?
where counts as relevant to getting the sense of what Sellars means by ostensible perceiving.
No, of course.
We should be focusing on cases where Sellars' story about the logic of looks fits. So we should be focusing on experiencing that, as it were, claim something, and restrict to claim something involving proper and common sensibles of the relevant sense, proper sensibles of the relevant sense, common sensibles, and now it could be visual experiencings. Focus on visual experiencings. And Sellars does this, not just in that section, in EPN. Think of some claim involving, I'll say, presence, right, of visual sensibles. And then we think about a color. Here's a class of experiences. Experiences that, as it were, claim that an instance of that is out there, present to the perceiver. And now we've got ostensible perceivings of that. This isn't just any old use of seeming, right? I mean, it's
but
looks as
right, but
helpfully discussed by Sellars in that section of EPN. And now,
right, but he does acknowledge explicitly room for a couple of different uses of seams and a couple of different uses of appear words, and it seems to me that might
Greg's
be
point kicks in that's not relevant.
It's not relevant, but
Yeah.
it's a bigger genus of seems not.
Right, but then the
But
bigger
what we're
genus is
interested in
not
here,
what-
you're right,
yeah.
quite,
Mhm.
yeah.
okay.
Good. So let's move on to the next hand, or is there a finger left?
It's a hand.
A new one. Yeah, Matt was first.
Okay.
It's more of the same, I'm very sorry to say, but...
Disguised as a hand.
Sorry. Right. But it's a question perhaps from, further outside Sellarsism or something. I've been struggling with the interpretation of this proposition, somehow a cube of pink in physical space is present in the perception other than is merely believed in. It seems like part of the disagreement here depends on stronger and weaker readings of what that claim is. It seems to me like Johannes is right, that if it merely means there is a difference between perceiving something and believing something, then it's not obvious to me that you need to refer to the case of ostensible seeing to see that that's the right distinction to draw. The perception has a vividness that belief does not. My understanding of the position that Jim and John were taking was that they had a stronger reading of what the passage was committing us to, and that they were thinking that the case of ostensible seeing was necessary. It was necessary to refer to that in order to get this stronger claim about something to do with the actuality of the cube.
Mm-hmm.
But so asking a little bit of a can you just talk me into the Sellarsian picture as a way in here? There's an equation that takes place over your page 7 between three ideas, I guess. Right, you first quote Sellars, and Sellars' proposition was the famous observation. Then you reformulate something that has merely intentional inexistence. And then again you reformulate it and you say something that is non-conceptual. Right?
Okay.
And people might, you might think that insofar as there's a phenomenological datum, it is only plausibly connected with some of those ideas and not others. The question is, this is put as a phenomenological principle, right? It's meant to be something that somehow reflective articulation of what's manifest requires us to concede. What reflective articulation of what's manifest makes obvious to me is that there's a difference between having an object as a topic of thought and as a content of perception.
Okay.
I totally grant that. So maybe that's the right way to read the first remark about believing. Right? Believing is just standing in for a mode of representation that's not vivid in the way that sensible, perceptual presence is. Now, in the long-standing usage of the idea of intentional, that wouldn't be a distinction between the intentional and the non-intentional. It would be a distinction between two modes of intentionality, I guess. Right? If you were Brentano, you would say, the perception has its mode of intentionality, and thought or belief has its. So now here's a reason I can think of for making the transition to not intentional. It would be to emphasize a claim that there must actually be something pink. Right, and then we would be off to the races, I think, with this problem which Johannes was drawing our attention to, of the relationship between pink as ascribed wherever there's seeming perceptual presence, and pink as ascribed to cubes in actual space. But I don't see that that's a bit of the phenomenological datum. So question 1, did Sellars think it was? Question 2, if so, why?
Question 3, how do you motivate it?
Yeah, right, I guess, yes.
Well, he does in fact use, I guess I don't see that I've got those actual quotes, but he does actually use the word, actual, and talk about the actuality of the pinkness and the cubicity, and even in some the spatiality. So yes, he does think he is committed to that, those being actually present. But you have to get also. I think it's important to make sure that you understand, as it were, where the parentheses are, as it were, with those quantifiers. Right? It's something somehow a cube of pink in physical space. Right? And sound on Friday it sounded like sometimes people were reading that as somehow a cube of pink, end parenthesis, in physical space. And of course that's just wrong, because while in a veridical perception, yes, the cube of pink will be out there in physical space, if you're hallucinating a pink cube, you'll still have something, somehow a cube of pink in physical space present to you. But it won't, of course, be in physical space. It will be in somehow physical space, right? So you have to get the grouping indicators properly.
I understand that. I wasn't making too big trouble about that. It seems to me that if the claim involves this actuality claim,
right,
then the point that I think Johannes and Mark and maybe you too are rightly insisting on, that you can get into view the manifest distinction between perception and merely having the word appear on your screen, right, or representation in some non-vivid sense. That doesn't suffice to get us that's where I was thinking.
Well, but of course, to be a good Sellarsian, I'd have to say, look, I'm really worried about the idea that the difference here is one in vividness. The difference between my perception of the pink cube and my belief that there's a pink cube there is not merely one of vividness. That's that was Hume's problem,
very
right?
Casually, but take the Brentano way of drawing the distinction. Right, there are two modes of intentionality. Right, they're distinct as modes. It's not that one is on a continuum with the other in terms of vividness. The real thought is there's perceptual intentionality and there's the intentionality of thought.
Okay, that labels the problem nicely, but now what? Right, and Sellars does and develop a fairly decent theory of the intentionality of thought, right? Lingua form and blah blah blah. But then the question is, he warns us against assuming that the intentionality of sense is the intentionality of thought, and what does that really amount to?
Well, now what is a good question? But why this? That's what I'm asking. Right. Yes.
Well, we're back to my problem that I raised, right? I find the principle intuitively attractive, but I don't. You ask a question that I have trouble articulating a response to, other than, yeah, it seems right, and I'm unhappy with that, and so I was hoping, rather than just getting a bunch of challenges on that, I would hope someone would say something that would say, "Oh, okay, now I see," but I'm not there yet.
But in fact, what you were just referring to, that's really helpful, because this other mode of intentionality is, I think, all he needs at that point. Because what he now does is, and that's where, of course, the ostensibility is kicking in, he's saying, okay, this mode of intentionality can be present in different cases. And maybe one doesn't want to go there, but okay, now he's saying, okay, it can be present in this case, and in this case, delusion, hallucination, and veridical case. And now they do not seem to be relevantly different to us. So here's something we ought to explain. And I do not think, I never intended to defend this, because I'm really not that convinced of that move, but I think that is a move that is there. It's not simply okay, now we take the actual out of there, and then we, with respect to actuality, independent of this being an intentional content, we think about it in hallucination and illusion, because that is not something that would be possible according to Sellars, because everything has to be, of course, conceptually shaped, and that means intentionally shaped insofar as it is conscious. So we couldn't do that other by way of an explanatory inference. And that is the whole...
But the key, I thought what we were arguing about was whether, in what we're explaining here, we need to focus on what the two sensory moments have in common. See, if we're just focusing on thought of something versus sensory, something being given in sensation, then the only thing we've got in common is something that's specified, in terms of the thought dimension. So we're not going to find. That's not going to, yield any pressure to two actualities that are common at the level of sense. It seems like you get that by focusing on two cases of sensing, both of which have something common in terms of the specification of the content, but you want to say they don't just have something common at the level of the intentional content, but they also must have something common in their sensory aspect. And the right way to understand what they have common in their sensory aspect is something common that is present to sense in both cases, regardless of what else is the case. And to get that, it seems like we need to be considering.
But that was not the claim. The claim was that in this way of being intentionally sensory present, as we have it in an experience, it's intentional through and through, of course. This is the intentionally informed sensory consciousness that Sellars has, and John thinks he doesn't have. Okay, but if it is, then there is an inference to an explanation, and this is invoked in sensations, and sensations are no earlier invoked then with this, I mean, but what you now just did is that you said, okay, as long as it's thought, we don't have a problem at all. In a way, that is right, because not insofar as it is thought.
No, I meant insofar as the two things we're comparing is a sensing that such and such and a merely believing that such and such. There's no need to, there isn't any pressure as far as I can see to parse the way things are thought in the sensory. That forces us on us the idea of something which is presence to sense, which has to be cashed out distinctly from what it is for something to be present to both aspects at once. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a difference, but we want to make a certain kind of move, and that it's hard to see. I have trouble seeing what even pushes that move unless we're reflecting on different kinds of presence to sense, where we say this class, qua presences to sense have something in common, and what they have in common should be understood in terms of a common actuality relative to sense. Other than that, I don't see what pushes it.
Please allow Jean to step in here.
Well, I was just going to say, something seemed to me to be beginning to go wrong when you, Johannes, suggested that you could simply take on board Matt's idea. Let's think like Brentano. Two modes of intentionality. I think the whole point of what Sellars wants to say about, and now this is neutral language, the sensory aspect of perceptual or ostensibly perceptual experiencing, is that there's no intentionality to it. That's the whole point. There is no intentionality to that. The Brentano idea of a sensory or perceptual mode of intentionality belongs with some thought like thought is a very compendious concept. Insofar as intentionality belongs to the objects of thought, we have to note that experiencing is a mode of thinking, right? Brentano perceptual or intentional, whatever, sensory intentionality, is what Sellars is. It is some basic thought about the sensory aspect of experiencing. There's no intentionality in the truth about that. We can focus on the truth about that by itself. So whatever you say about this language for capturing the sensory aspect, it isn't. There isn't peace between you and Matt speaking for Brentano. You can't say, "Oh yes."
I grant that there isn't peace between us the way you read Sellars.
Matt,
because this is not his core belief. Doesn't seem to me to be represented in the right way.
I was just going to say very, very quickly that. So suppose you went through this Brentano picture where there are two modes of intentionality, right? And then you observed that in the case of perceptual intentionality, it can be present both where there's actually a pink ice cube and where there isn't, right? Nothing would straight away follow about, right? I mean, intentionality in general is something that tolerates the absence of its object. So there'd be our characterization of the thing would have supplied what looks like a characterization of the sameness that doesn't require, descending to some other level, talking about something actual or whatever. The sameness is that they both perceptually intend a pink ice cube.
And the of has the same logical grammar.
Absolutely, it does.
But I thought our discussion was about, I thought John was raising a question about the aspect of Sellars, which has to do with Sellars wanting to say sensation.
That's what I want to talk about.
As a sui generis logical grammar. And I would have thought that Sellars entitling himself to that and his entitling himself to think Bill's interested in, which I think does seem to be in Sellars, namely that there's a mode of actual presence to sense at the level of these two sensory experiences that get grouped together in the case of ostensible seeings are related topics. And I take it Matt's point is there isn't anything in the Brentano idea that gives you any pressure move there.
The ofteness of sensation is different. That's true. That is absolutely true. But it's the ofteness of sensation as it is inferred by the sense impression inference as an explanatory ontological point. Sense impressions are of whatever, red or what have you, but they are introduced by abstracting from the sensory aspect qua of the experience, qua intentional mode of perception, and that's different. We do not have consciousness of sense impressions. He's very clear about that. And insofar as we can have consciousness of them, they are twice removed.
Michael.
I just want to follow up on what Johannes said, because I think it makes it more problematic than... I'm not even convinced that they are introduced by abstraction, and this was... How little I understand Sellars on this was brought home to me recently by reading J. Rosenberg on Sellarsian picturing, where he has a very interesting account of animal representation. And he's not really talking initially about sensation there at all, but it seems to me that what he says about the kind of tracking relation that really sensations in Sellars' view stand into the environment would actually be a perfect... It would make the theory of picturing, particularly as exhibited in the imaginary language, John Blee's, a perfectly good account of the kind of iconic representing that sensations do, because Jay beautifully brings out the distinction between pictorial complexity and logical complexity. There are modes of aggregation that are not logical conjunctions, so you can represent in the pictorial way many aspects of the scene around, but without logical operators, and therefore without propositionality in the full sense in the things combined. So if you look at it like that, there's actually no connection between sensations and any phenomenology. I mean, animals who don't have a phenomenology can represent in the way sensations as functionally introduced with reliable but not inviolate causal relations to the environment, and then intrinsic characteristics which are simply exemplified in functional exclusion relations. So you can't be of red and of green at the same time. And you can build on that the kind of pseudo-inferentiality, but it's got nothing to do with entailment or anything like that. You can do computations on them, basically. There's no link from this generic concept of representation to anything phenomenological. The sensory presence of the pinkness of the pink ice cube. And Sellars does seem to think that, but once he's introduced sensations in this functional way, he's done so he's also, as it were, given us a link to the phenomenology, perhaps via the idea that in some sense they're common to veridical and non-veridical cases. But of course that doesn't do it. And so I feel a lot of this discussion has been bypassing some of the issues that Sellars raises, namely that his account of sensation itself is so functional and so disconnected from apperception, as he himself says. And by the way, it comes out very clearly in spatiality, which Bill introduces and then moves over to colour. Rosenberg points out, it seems to me quite correctly, you don't want to give the content of animal spatial representation in a way that looks even remotely like the possession of the first person pronoun or token reflexives. Right. And Rosenberg has an account of what he calls pure positional awareness, in which presumably the animal representational state, I mean, they instantiate the map, and the mode of representation involves some kind of triangulation of environmental landmarks, which enables them to locate themselves and orient towards those landmarks and recompute as they move. There's no phenomenology here. There doesn't have to be. The generic notion is independent of phenomenology. And yet everybody's talking about sensory presence, but the generic definition of this non-intentional, as Johannes so correctly points out, this non-intentional mode of representation doesn't underwrite a notion of presence without further specification of what supposedly is going on in the human case. But I don't see that further specification in Sellars. There's some casual remarks in Science and Metaphysics where he says they're in a way conscious. But if you want to know what that means, I think you'll wait an awfully long time. And because
you have to read Stefan Kant.
So I think that it's very difficult for me. Perhaps this is a cry for help. I used to think I understood this, and I don't. It's very difficult for me to even relate the generic account of non-intentional representation to any issue about the phenomenology of sensory consciousness. I know Sellars thinks there's a relationship, but I don't see it.
Yeah, Bill, please.
This is a groping first try, but do you think that there needs to be some kind of relationship between the sensory as such and the phenomenology? I mean, because it's experiences that have phenomenological characteristics, right? But experiences are always more than sensations. Having a sensation doesn't guarantee you any phenomenology until it becomes part of an experience, and that it does by being conceptualized, right? So you don't the experience, the sensations themselves.
But now I'm losing it, Bill. I mean, you're the one who's got the phenomenological principle, and we've been talking about sensations, and that's supposed to be in some way the added element that mere thought doesn't have. At least that's the way Sellars talks, anyway. When I read him superficially, as I do.
Well, but I mean, doesn't that have to do with how it is that, I mean, and this is just putting the label on a big problem, I think, but how it is exactly that the sensation is a part of the experience. I mean, the experiences for him are complex things, right? They've got a conceptual aspect, a sensory aspect.
It's worse than that. It's far worse than that. It's the way that they're
How much worse, though?
It's the way that sensation is introduced as non-intentional. Makes it look as if it couldn't be the sort of thing that could be, quote, part of the experience. I mean, it can't just be. It can't just be. It cannot just. See, John talks unashamedly of shapings of sensory consciousness. It cannot be that consists of, as it were, a kind of claiming in the context of this non-apperceived, functionally defined state. I think that's what John thinks. The Sellarsian solution is passing by any even description of what we're trying to get at, much less any explanation.
But in this paper, Bill was referring to John's paper, he's very beautifully lining out Sellars' complex story about image models and all that stuff. And he thinks it doesn't do the trick for reasons which might be disputed, but at least there's a taking up. For Sellars, it's all about taking up of sense impressions into consciousness, and in so taking them up, we are conceptually informing them. But that is different. That doesn't make those things sort of thoughts themselves, but it is integrating those very sense impressions in whatever is the complex representation, conscious representation of things as being in physical space. And so there is a lot of, maybe that doesn't do the trick for the reasons John points out in this paper, but at least it is more than simply saying, well, yeah, and then there's the sensations, and somehow they are very, very remote. This is very important.
There's one finger back in the room.
Just a quick point. You made this couple mentions the computation and animal perception, and how somehow when an animal is having a sensory experience that's sort of more conducive to computation, and somehow computation is lacking some phenomenological aspect, and then the other side of this is, okay, non-computable, or I don't want to say non-computable, that might have a technical sense, but could you elaborate on how computation and phenomenology is maybe two divisions, like you're dividing things that are...
No, I didn't make a division. I just said the way that these things are introduced by Sellars, the way he discusses them in the paper on animal representation, they're just introduced functionally. So they have a kind of symbolic aspect to them, and there are algorithms that operate on the symbols, basically. I mean, Sellars is assuming classical architecture, of course.
But if you look at
that conceptually, that gives you no link in and of itself to anything to do with phenomenology. I mean, now Johannes wants to say there's a way in which you can make the link by you take these up into, but for me that's just Sellars putting a name on what his view really doesn't enable us very easily to understand. I mean, I can accept it as perhaps identifying a problem, but I can't accept it as the solution to a problem. I mean, when I said I didn't understand Sellars, I could rephrase it as I don't understand what the taking up, in other words, I can just not disagree with you, but just say you've identified what I don't understand.
Mark? Well, just very quickly, follow. Yeah, I mean, surely putting into the space of reasons is a non sequitur with regard to Michael's problem. I mean, if the sensation is introduced in this functional way as just the thing that serves to give us tracking relations to the world, we know perfectly well that can be implemented. We've got all of these models from cognitive scientists who can implement that in incredibly simple systems that have nothing remotely like phenomenology, little bugs and shit. And then it doesn't look like putting that into the space of reasons and making it conceptual is getting you phenomenology. So I take the question to be, where in the story is there something phenomenal? And you can say, as an extra thing, it gets taken up into consciousness, but then the question is, A, why does Sellars think that's important? Because he's now got tracking relations in the space of reasons. Isn't that all he wanted? And B, what does it mean?
Sellars himself will do this with robots when he feels like it. I mean, to illustrate how it works.
Those questions are good questions. I just deny that there aren't resources for answering them.
Well, what are they?
Well, one of them is, for instance, that we, as he constantly distinguishes between the order of being and the order of knowing. It is for him a viable option that things which are for animals merely do not have any phenomenal dimension can, as we employ them, have a phenomenal dimension for us, or constitute a phenomenal or dimension for us. That would be, I think, the case in sense impressions. The case for sense impressions is not merely tracking, of course, because if it would be only tracking, as you suggested, it could be done otherwise, with symbols and what have you. So here we have another argument going from the argument for sense impressions does not simply consist in their tracking function, although the tracking function, as it turns out, is part of what sense impressions are able to do.
But I didn't say sense impressions, I said sensations. I think they're not the same thing.
They are not the same thing, but he is not talking about, insofar as he talks about the offness of sensation that is explained by sense impressions, and they are ultimately ultimately they are identified with something completely different, which is different both from sense impressions and from sensations. But that is not. I mean, if you have sensations if he uses sensations in the animal case, and merely as tracking and not as in the phenomenal sense, then they are pretty much what sense impressions are. So I would argue for that, but we would have to.
What about Rosenthal's kind of view, where you've got these homeomorphic properties instantiated in the animal that map certain aspects of the environment and bring them to consciousness to have a higher order thought about them?
Well, see, that's an interesting answer. That's an attempt to say that you actually. I of course you could just say we might happen to do it this way, and isn't that neat? But that's kind of unsatisfying. This would be an attempt to say that you actually can't do some of the functional conceptual work unless it's got the structure of a phenomenal. Right. That would be a neat story, but I don't think that's anywhere in Wilfred.
I'm not so sure. I mean, David does a nice job showing up. Well, put it this way: David argues that to the extent that it's not in Wilfred, it should be.
That's
that it's
there are lots of things for which you can say that.
Yeah, right. But he can get you a fair way towards it, I think, before he has to make that leap of. And here's what he should have said as well. Well, I mean that's what he did at the Dublin conference.
I know I didn't understand any of the parts where he was putting it in Wilfred. I understood the story, but I didn't understand any of it.
So Jim next, and then Joe.
So there's a story. There's a story in Sellars that kind of starts from someplace and moves up to consciousness as we know it. And there's another story in Sellars where we start from consciousness and we work down. And the finger that points up and the finger that points down, I take it, are supposed to meet. So our initial discussion, in which we're starting with various complex, intentionally and sensorily structured moments of perceptual consciousness, and then abstracting out what is supposed to be the sensory in them, is part of a methodological movement that involves the pointing down finger. The stuff that Michael's talking about, which is certainly there, where we have a certain story, a generic story about creatures whose responses are cued to the environment in such a way that they track. It's the pointing down figure. One of these is not right and the other's not wrong. They're both part of the story, and they're supposed to meet. Now, the fact that Sellars calls the kind of tracking he's interested in our case, the nodes in this symbolic network, sensations, isn't just misleading terminology. It's because it's supposed to meet the finger coming down, which is focusing and trying to abstract out the stuff that already on phenomenological grounds, has traditionally been known as the sensory in philosophy. So these things are supposed to meet. Now, I don't think in Sellars that it's right about Sellars to say. He has nothing to say about how they meet. He wants these fingers to meet, and I think he has attempts to try to say how they meet at various points. We spent a whole lot of our first workshop last year talking about one of those arguments, which I think has to do with this idea of external guidance in S&M, where he thinks unless they meet, our very idea of a cognitive capacity is going to fall apart. If we're going to make sense of a capacity of knowledge, these things that figure as the sensory dimension here have to figure up with sensations this way, or we'll fall into a bad kind of idealism. We don't want to fall apart into a bad kind of idealism. Condition of adequacy on not doing that, these things must, meet. I confess I'm not persuaded by that argument. That argument seems to me to involve something like the minor premise. There is no other way to avoid catastrophe, so we must avoid it this way. That's a hard thing to show. There's no other way to
I don't think he shows the meeting, though, Jim. I
agree with you.
He's committed to it.
No, I'm agreeing with you. I don't think he does either. I'm saying it's not that he has nothing to say about it. He has arguments that are supposed to. I'm mentioning one. I think his how he argues this is different at different stages. That argument turns on a premise. There is no other door but this one, which I think is a false premise, and so it doesn't show what it's supposed to. But I do think both parts of the story, the one we started by talking about, and the one you've introduced, the movement from within full-blown sensory consciousness down, and the one from some picture of what it would be to hook up responsively to an environment where we can see a certain kind of responsive hookup as guided by the environment in a way that doesn't yet bring in intentionality, are supposed to meet. And he has arguments that try to show this, which I'm not convinced by. And if one's not convinced by those arguments, then one can, this is just going back to the first part of the discussion, one can raise worries about whether that pointing finger that's pointing from above, below, penetrates as far as it's supposed to, whether it's picked out something which is two things, sensations, which are elements in order of actuality, which, the ostensible seeings have in common as elements in the order of actuality. Because that's what they're pointing down to, is, elements in the order of actuality, which, are identical in the realm of respect. And so the first part of that discussion, where I was, expressing worries about that, are connected with worries about whether, the two fingers meet. I think they're related issues.
Oh, you've stated the problem beautifully, but, the only thing I would dissent from, it's a mild dissent, is I'm not convinced he has any arguments. He has a this or nothing type argument, although he doesn't like arguments like that. And when Chisholm and Firth, in favour of their traditional epistemologies say this or nothing. Sellers says this is a terrible argument. In other words,
we were talking about this last year. I think his most
like
interesting argument is the external guidance argument in science and metaphysics, which I think is sort of C.I. Lewis inspired in a certain way. I don't think it works.
No, I don't.
So I'm not disagreeing with you about the fundamental issue, but I think there is an attempt, sort of on transcendental grounds, to motivate the thought that they must meet. So it's not that it's not that he just says, okay, and they meet. He tries to motivate it.
I see 2 fingers left, and after those we should move on to another hand. So John, you had raised one, and then Mark here.
Well, actually, I don't know if this is going to be helpful. I wanted to say something that would partly line up with what Johannes was saying and would leave the question Michael was raising actually not urgent. Anyway, not in the form in which he's raising it. The way I think it's helpful to do this is to go back to thinking in Kantian terms. Right, so here's a right thing to say using Kantian language. You don't have to have an understanding in order to have sensibility, if we're thinking about animals, right? Animals don't have to have understanding in order to have sensibility. Sellars has got a lot of stuff to say, and that's what Michael was pointing to, about how to understand what sensibility might do for animals that have it and don't have understanding, and it's kind of not irrelevant to their ability to hack it in their environment, to cope in their environment. But now, just going on being a bit kind of Kantian, when sensibility is present in an animal that has understanding, this strikes me as something like unproblematic, right? The fact that we're talking now about animals that have understanding means that we're talking about animals such that the perturbations of sensibility in them are conscious states, and in some sense conscious, but it isn't that there's some sort of deep issue about how what in mere brutes isn't, because there isn't any question of consciousness, gets to be conscious. It should be something like kind of obvious routine. This is the sort of difference that being not a mere possessor of sensibility, but a possessor of sensibility. I know we say use all the kind of in the service of understanding, but understanding is a power of knowing of a quite distinctive kind. Standings in the space of reasons, all that stuff. It needs sensibility to and sensibility. It's clear now that sensibility is doing a different kind of thing, a kind of thing it couldn't do if it were simply loose from a concept of consciousness that is newly in play in this new. It's not a big deal that it wasn't in play, this concept of consciousness, when we were talking about. Everybody says animals as if we weren't animals. When we were talking about
mere
animals, yeah. So the idea that Sellars has some problem of explaining how something that just is what perturbations of sensibility are in animals that don't have understanding, because somehow that's supposed to be still with us, how something that conforms to that description could somehow figure in an upward route that is going to be met by Jim's downward way. It isn't there. That's not what perturbations of sensibility are for us. It's kind of part of the point of those cases of sensibility at work, that they aren't yet within the scope of consciousness in a sense that's in play only because we are the special kind of animal that we are. That leaves me still just not agreeing that the sense impression inference is
right. But
I really don't think this is a big deal.
Jim, there's two senses of meat that the fingers might meet in. One is, you could say, the downward arrow, we start with just these plain phenomenological facts that we have things present to us in this phenomenal way. That's what we're like. We give a nice description of us. And then we have this story, this sort of Millikan-type story about tracking and all of this stuff. And then we add to it the space of reasons and conceptual responsibilities. And they meet in the sense that we see that all of that rich stuff about us is one way of instantiating what we got building up. That's one sense. And there I think Sellars has, I agree with both of you that it's not necessarily a convincing argument, but he has at least an argument trying to show that. But if that's all there is, then it just looks like, as it were, a lucky accident that we have the phenomenal stuff. A zombie could do it. A zombie that's in the space of reasons got merely a completely opaque state that tracks the environment in the right way and that commits it and then gets responded to and argued with and all of that, would seem to be another possibility. Now, maybe Sellars is happy with that, but I take it that what Michael's point is it would sort of be more satisfying if there was some reason why not just they met in the sense that totally phenomenally conscious critters like us are instantiations of knowers, but that we have to have all those elements to be knowers, and that's what I don't even see a purported argument for now.
Well, I don't think the Sellars things work, but I do think you're under-describing it in a way that also makes it less interesting. It is. So I both, at the same time, think it doesn't work, but thinks that it's a really heroic attempt to try to do something, which, seeing why it doesn't work, is philosophically informative. So Johannes and I are kind of weird friends in this. We're both thinking it's really worth getting these details straight, even if we don't quite agree about. But so first of all, the point there's a lot. I mean, your picture was more like pointing at something, pointing up, and trying to hit it. My pointing down figure was also moving down a lot. So there is a rather elaborate exercise, I think, starting from the full complexity of both intentionally and sensually shaped phenomenal experience to pair off the sensory aspect of it. I think it's connected to some of the arguments that Bill's talking about. So we're looking at various kinds of cases of, experiencing something pink and rectangular and trying to get at the pink aspect, all of them. And it's merely so there's an attempt to, as it were, parse down to a notion of the sensory as such, starting from this, from full-blown consciousness. So we're not just taking it as full-blown, we're trying to separate that aspect, and these phenomenological arguments and various other things are meant to parse that out. I mean, whether they parse as finely as they want and the way they want is something we were discussing in the beginning. And then the thing working up, the reason we call those elements in the tracking system sensations is precisely because they're supposed to, in some sense, ultimately emerge as identical with that thinnest aspect of the sensory aspect of our consciousness. And then I think he has an argument about why the thing that is co-describable in these two ways, as the merely, and this is, I think, C.I. Lewis inspired, the merely as unalterable qualitative phenomenal aspect of consciousness stripped from all concepts, and the thing that allows the world to get a voice in, are two names of the same thing. If they weren't, the very concept of knowledge would fall apart. I don't think it's a good argument.
I agree with that.
But it is meant to be an argument that actually motivates the thought that the thinnest thing we got moving down from the high position, and the thickest thing we get kind of enriching moving up, must, as it were, converge at this middle point, because something we want of each turns out to be sort of, you might say, a common functional role they're playing in the two places, hooking us to the world. So there's an idea of hooking to the world that we get in one position, the other, and it's supposed to be the same thing. I don't think it works, but I think there's a lot more detail in this that requires a story about how we abstract from the unity of experience, which I wasn't hearing in what you said.
Sure. I think we should move on to the next hand, which is
mine's a different line. I'm happy to let 1,000 fingers blossom before you come, because mine's a different line. Well, Matthew,
okay, we postpone your hand for some more
if you want
discussion on that. Okay.
I just wondered about something John said a minute ago. I like the structure of what you said, that there's no project. There needn't be any project of building up from the animal sensory awareness to something that we have. I thought that the question here was different. It was a question about whether the story about sensations as merely theoretical entities could be related to the story about sensations as things we reach by abstraction from what's consciously present. And now, I thought maybe you had some thought about the relationship between those two disputes, and I would be interested to hear it or something. That really somehow in the idea of sensory presence that is making the problem here, there is some implicit commitment to this other enterprise. No, you don't.
I shouldn't have even said the one more thing that I said, but now I've got to say one more thing. I mean, unless when in talking about sensations as theoretical, you're alluding to the myth of Jones, and then there's something in it, though not just theoretical, he has to quickly say. I think the idea that sensations are theoretical is just wrong on Sellars' part. They're not. The talk of sensations is just talk of sensibility doing its thing. Sensibility doing whatever sensibility does in the context, and how to understand that is part of the question of full-blown experiencing. And the idea that that's theoretical strikes me as just awful, a bad mistake.
That's fine, but there is in Sellars, you admit, a project of this bad kind.
Right, but it all comes from the very idea. I don't think Sellars calls the thing that Johannes calls by this name, the sense impression inference. In Sellars, it's supposed to be an inference to the claim that there are sensations when one has a, e.g., visual experience. And that's supposed to be an inference. And the idea that it's an inference strikes me as misunderstanding the way the idea of, as I was putting it, perturbations in sensibility figures in a coherent, sane picture of what perceptual experiencing is. Experiencing has a sensory aspect. That's not a theoretical claim. That's all it means to talk about, to talk sense anyway about sensations.
That doesn't sound right, because to say that we have a sensory aspect, to talk about sensations is you're already implying that there's some kind of individuation identity, that we can worry about the sameness of sensations. You can do maybe some psychophysical stuff, and merely talking about a sensory aspect just doesn't even begin to address that. So there is a difference between talking about sensations as entitative, or maybe they're just states of things, but in any case they've got they're distinct from each other in various different ways, etc. That's more. There's more going on there than just talking about a sensory aspect. Right? It's spelling that out in some way.
Talk of sensations inherits its kind of individuative and etc. Shape from talk of experiences, which is they're not really super well behaved individuals' experiences. So you may talk of a sensation when you may talk of an experience, because the experience will have a sensory aspect, and it's going to be a complex sensation that you're thereby allowed to talk of. Furthermore, you may talk of a sensation in respect of each sensible that is in there in the content of the experience. There isn't some sort of autonomous thinginess that attaches to items that we allow ourselves to talk on under that head. But this is miles away from Sellars. Yeah.
Yeah, Jim, yeah.
Just by way of the project of diagnosing what's driving Sellars, so it's interesting that one of the things that's really driving them that doesn't drive us at all has nothing to do with non-veridical perception, but just already if you analyze the colored objects, there's supposedly a deep problem which he sympathizes with about how to fit the ultimate homogeneity of this expanse of pink.
John groans at the mention of the grain argument.
Yeah. No, it's not just, I don't think it's and it might not be trivially related to your needing to self-diagnose about the common. So what you get is, on his view, already just trying to analyze what it is to be a physical object is an expanse of pink, a soup of pink that isn't integratable into the physical world. And then the modern period, without necessarily considerations of non-veridicality, moves that into the mind. In Sellars' view, that doesn't help. He's probably right about that. But then where to put the soup of pink, and then it gets worse when you got two of them. It's true if you crush your eyeball, but
that's a real problem.
So it's already supposed to be a problem, and I've always thought the way to stop it is if it can be done, is in the first. So then diagnosing that, do we feel any pull to this question that there's any problem with integrating the color expanses into the physical world? And then when Sellars says in the Karras lecture, say that of course there are expanses of pink, we need to integrate the cube of pink, we got to recategorize it, we got to kick it around all over ontology, and it ends up at the base. So it might not just be the problem of non-veridical perception, and maybe the view of veridical perception that doesn't have a soup of pink that can't fit in will help with the problem of the.
See, I was really hoping no one would raise that question. I mean, the grain argument, I've busted my head over that for way too long, and I must admit I don't don't feel its force.
But take the account of perception. Take the account of sensible qualities. I mean, we've talked about what animates Sellars on this. It's that there are these sensible qualities which are expanses of pink, which don't fit in. And then when you get to the problem of then there's, if you say there's no grounds for that, which I'm very sympathetic to, rejecting the grain. I mean, I reject the grain argument. But then what remains of the, whatever your account is of perception in the veridical case that doesn't have problematic pools of pink, might help then with the fitting the other, with the aspects of the phenomenological principle that make it hard to fit them in the non-veridical. That doesn't give you the solution, but I mean, it's if you talk about what animated Sellars, that's the primary thing that animated Sellars, even before getting to the non-veridical case.
I think, he really believed he was onto something with the grain argument, that there really was a major problem here, and if you don't get it, then there's a whole bunch of things that seem strong motivations to him that just you sort of say, what? And yeah.
So there's a certain kind of there's a certain kind of relationship in the veridical case that if it doesn't involve the plants being pink, being problematic, in the way that has these properties that are supposed to have an intrinsic quality that's it might help with that problem, I think. I mean, the reason he thought it was a problem is it's already a problem, because you've got these quanta of color that aren't gonna fit in. Now that seems to me just false on the first step. So anyway, it's a different consideration. There's no aspect of non-verticality motivated in that.
One of the things I was sort of hoping would happen here, but hasn't, is we do more talking about the cubicity rather than the pinkness. I mean, pinkness has been sort of beaten to death in Sellarsian discussions, but I'm not sure we've actually really done full justice to the notion that, we see somehow supposedly a cube of pink in physical space is there, and so that's why I wanted to, frame it not in terms of pinkness, but in terms of space and time in perception. How is the space there? And he actually has that whole appendix in Science and Metaphysics on time. He obviously spent a lot of time worrying about just how time shows up for us and shows up in us.
And wouldn't you agree the only reason he's worried about the cube is because he's first worried about pink, right? The only reason he objects to adverbial theories that just talk about pink is you've got to talk about expanses of pink. So
volumes of pink.
Yeah, well, right. So if it's not a problem, okay.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to help here, but I thought I'd just kind of point something out about different issues. I mean, I admit I'm not moved by the pink ice cube business either. But it seems to me what moves you. I mean, part of what moves you has to do with larger ambitions of Sellars that have to do with the two images and how they connect. I mean, it's not as if within the manifest image it blows our mind. There are expanses of pink.
Right.
It's only once we're trying to go binocular and think the two images together.
That's right.
That we have right. And so if the whole picture of what the two images are and how they're connected and what it is to align them seems problematic, then that problem's going to fall away. Whereas the problem we were talking about before, which also has to do with sensation, and I admit these all come together in Sellars, but the problem we were talking about before, where Sellars is trying to connect the notion of sensation we can bootstrap out of, immanent reflection of the character of experience, with the notion of sensation that can hook us into the world in a way
and the whole point
that seems free of intentionality. That's a worry which I think he thinks is motivated by thinking through the Kantian project the way he tries to, which is not to say it's the right way to think it through. So he thinks, it belongs just to the manifest image, that if we reflect on it, we realize that concepts are things that come from us. The truth in psychological nominalism is that we have to classify things in certain ways, but we don't want these ways we classify things just to be, how we carve up the world. We want them to be anchored in some sort of way on something which guides our classification so they get better and worse. How are we going to tell that story of anchorage? We need to have the world itself guiding these things the right way. For our own manifest image picture of knowledge to work, we need to be able to hook up the intentional and the sensory in the right way. And he thinks he needs to pull this off in order to, as it were, vindicate our entitlement to our manifest image conception of ourselves as knowers. I don't think he's right about that, but the details of how he thinks he needs to do it. But that starts from a much more just Kantian picture.
No, I agree.
We have a theoretical cognitive capacity. How do we make sense of it? We don't have to have first-order physics that gives us a different image and put these things next to each other in order to kind of get sold on Sellars' project. And so if you do want to say something is wrong with Sellars' project, then I do think you need to be able to say in a kind of clear way how we can vindicate our credentials without getting
into that. I agree with Johannes and that this thing's generatable from within the manifest image and the problem that we've all been talking about. But it's just that I think when Mike asks, where does Sellars come by the idea that these basic kinds of tracking relationships to do with sensations aren't enough and that they need this extra bit? I think he's got premises from elsewhere that shape the way that he has to fill in further bits. I agree with you that he.
I agree these problems converge. I was just saying why one could find the one more compelling.
And I think one of the other things that he has in the back of his head, since he was always a committed realist, he wanted to be able to accommodate the idea that when we see the pink ice cube, we see its very pinkness, and that that phrase keeps coming back. It was to see its very pinkness, and so the way in which, as it were, what the pinkness is present to us can't be merely representational. Can't be I don't see the very I don't know what would be the the very metalness of the table legs or something like that. That's something that I have to get at in some other way. But I see the very pinkness, and somehow that has to be held. That's a basic thing for him, I think. And,
You're doing a good job at showing him.
But that's also connected with his idea that well, we've really got the world we grasp once we've gotten our concept straight is the world that is.
Yeah, well, of course, I mean, just because this is an interesting point that connects to our Kantian discussions, I think that we had this thing in Jim's talk, for instance, about constitutive categories and Grundsätze, principles, and those which are regulative but necessary for experience, like the analogies. And this corresponds to Kant's distinction between the mathematical and the dynamical categories. And this, where they talk about the very presence, blah blah blah, sets in Sellars is exactly where the mathematical categories are required, and it doesn't affect what he has to say, what we have to say about what we have to say about things when we apply the dynamical categories about causality and dispositional question and so on. So there is something here that mirrors something that is in Kant as well.
Right, I don't see the very solubility of the salt,
exactly,
but I do see its very whiteness.
So that's why image models only adhere to the mathematical categories, and only if we refer this image model to something out there, when we take it as being an object out there in space, it has causal and dispositional properties.
So you think the image models are...
Image models do not have causal or dispositional properties, they have merely sensible properties.
But can't we animate them?
No, as soon as we animate them, we have to sort of envisage them as something existing independently from us in space and time. We can walk around. We cannot walk around image models, but we can walk around objects in space and time, and that's what we take image models to be. But image models are essentially perspectival, for instance, and objects in space aren't.
Now there would be time for your hand, Jim, or was it the hand, the pinkness, grain argument business? Okay, that was the hand. Okay. Early on, Michael, you raised the hand.
No, that was my hand.
I mean, one of your many finger
Jim has made a very useful supplement. I mean, the real problem, I think, with coming to terms with Sellars is, and it just comes out in, John, for example, just doesn't take a lot of problems that Sellars thinks are problems to be problems. In fact, he said, I don't think, in a way, John and I really disagree about this bottom-down, top-down, bottom-up stuff. John said, it's just a mistake, in fact. So it's already a solution to something that John doesn't think is, it's raising a dust. Well, Jim thinks, I think there's a third element, though, about this meeting. My difficulty is to see how any one thing can do all the things it's supposed to do. Jim brought in the clash of the images, and then the other thing that comes out very much in a lot of Sellars is, which is why I think he's not quite happy to talk about the way sensibility is in us. I mean, maybe he should be, but I think it's a reason he isn't. He's very concerned in philosophy and the scientific image of man not to see a discontinuity between the human and the rest of even the animal world.
Me too.
But I think his sense of what would constitute the discontinuity is not the same as yours. And so I think a third thing that Jim's finger pointing up is supposed to do is to, as it were, fill in all the gaps in the great chain of being, so to say, so that what you get from starting at the top by abstraction and what you get by building up from the animals, or even from the robots that he talks about in a lot of his papers. You make it meet, and then the last refuge of special creation, as he says about the human, is no longer a worry. That's his phrase. I mean, and you know, if you don't share that complex of metaphysical intuitions that Sellars, I think, certainly has with the presence of the pinkness and the worry of discontinuities, then it's very hard to sympathise with him wanting an apparatus that solves all. You know, he's juggling a lot of philosophical issues in the air at once, and I think some of us here, John thinks that some of them just don't deserve to be in the air, and then some think maybe they do, but Sellars dropped them, you know, right?
But I mean, I think we can pull the last two sessions together a little bit more closely by saying, I think a lot of them were in the air in John's talk. I mean, it depends what it is to be in the air, but they were in the air for a while. That is, I mean, some of what's at issue with these two pointing fingers is Sellars. I'll put this very abstractly in a way that is not, you know, faithful to detail of Sellars, but can connect the two talks. So something was in the air in both discussions. Something Sellars thinks we need. I mean, what's interesting, maybe I'll start in different places. Sellars has a reading of Kant that up to a point is strikingly reminiscent of the one John was giving us. I mean, that is, we have a story about sensory consciousness in which we are not going to be able to understand what it is for an intuition to have the kind of content it does unless it's a this such. And we're not going to be able to understand what a this such is unless that's an exercise of a capacity that is part of a bundle that includes the capacity of judgment. So we also can say this is a such and such. And so even though it's there, you know, being apprehended non-predicatively, that capacity to thus apprehend the thing non-predicatively requires the capacity for predication. So, I mean, there's a lot in Sellars' story. As the finger has moved, this finger I had in my answer to Mark moving down has moved quite far down, but we're still, as it's moving down into, you know, an examination of sensory consciousness, still in completely McDowellian territory. But then he wants it to push down to a point where he can say, as long as we only consider that, as long as we only have a McDowellian level degree of drilling down, we stand under a threat that the forms of mindedness that we bring to the world aren't appropriately guided by the world. I think he has some worry like that. So he thinks we need to drill down to a point where we can identify the sensory as contributing, shall we say, a voice to the outcome in the exercise of our cognitive capacity that hasn't yet been infused or infected or informed by the understanding. So that idea is very similar to the idea that we're left with when we have the deduction read halfway in the talk we had this morning. I mean, the talk read halfway involves the idea there is some conception of, I mean, it depends how you understand it, but there is some conception of sense functioning as a genuinely cognitive capacity, you know, in some sense, at a remove from the sensory manifold informed by the understanding, which could introduce that independent voice in the outcome without threatening a problem. And the point of the argument of the second half of the deduction, as John was presenting it, is no, that's not going to work. If you try to give sense an autonomous voice like that, then by the time you bring in the understanding, it's going to come too late for us to have a coherent story. So
that's all true, but the guidance, Jim, in science and metaphysics is bound up for Sellars in the end in a way it never would be for John.
No,
with the transcendental scientific realism and everything.
I think you're mistaking the way in which I had something common here. The target of John's talk is related to the thing in Sellars we're rejecting here. So that's the sense in which they're both in the air. So it's not that John's just saying this doesn't interest me.
Oh no, I didn't think. No,
okay, right.
He said it's a mistake many times that Sellars makes to join issues which some of which John thinks. I'm speaking for John, shouldn't be. Some of which John thinks are perfectly genuine. Some of which he does not. I mean, he actively.
Well, I'm changing the word mistake to a rather deep temptation or something like that, which is at the center of that reading of
the transcendental deduction to ward off.
I was quoting mistake.
Right, no, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying it's not any old mistake. So, I mean, there's the talks join at that point, it seems.
Any other finger or hand?
Would you like to ask a question?
I don't see. Oh, there's the hand.
Yeah, no, that's something I just would like to ask Bill about. I mean, in your paper you have this criticism of John's view about spatiality, and at the very end, I mean, what is it, page 11 following. Isn't it a difficulty that in McDowell's view all the supposedly sensory qualities inform the intentionality of intuition, so that we ought to drop not just a cue from specification of what the item is of, we ought to drop everything in the vocabulary of proper and common sensible sensations end up having no content at all. I'm pushing McDowell to its dilemma here. Either sensation can be equally both spatial and say colored, or they end up empty and useless. Since this was not the way I read John's paper, I just wanted to bring our attention to that and maybe hear what John would have to say.
Right, don't ask me, ask him.
Yeah, well, it's just, I mean, you should maybe clarify your criticism as well. I'm not sure.
I mean, he tells us that we can abstract away from the cubicity because the cubicity informs the intentionality of the intuition. But as I say,
this is for arriving at a specification of, and now I will say, the sensory aspect of experiencing in Jim's top-down way.
Right.
So it's a way of arriving at a specification of something, in connection with which we can say, okay, now we've got it specified in such a way as to conform to Kant's characterization of sensations, modifications of the subject's state. And the way I take that, this was the exhaustively characterizable bit, was not conceived as cases of Brentano intentionality, perceptual intentionality, I don't know what it was called, but not conceived as that. I don't know. That's what I was trying to do. Something I can't process in Bill's description of what I was trying to do is the talk of me as, and I can't remember now where this is, finding a point in the idea that sensations are actually colored. That's a bit further on. That's on page 12. I find no point in that idea. I mean, it would have to be the idea that under enough of an abstraction so that we're thinking of experience things in a way that conforms to Kant's specification of sensations, we've arrived at something that we're conceiving as colored. And no, we're not. We've arrived at something that we're conceiving as of this or that color. I'm sorry about the mysteriousness to you of the idea of the vestigial use of the of intentionality. You actually quote, I mean, I didn't have my text, but you quote the bit.
You use the word vestigial.
But you quote the bit that's meant to be an explanation of why I say vestigial. I mean, it's intentionality, all right. We arrive at these specifications by leaving out something that would need to be there if the role of the color word in the description of the thing, sensation of red, were, as in this use of it, a specification of a sensible that is perceived or ostensibly perceived to characterize something. And if we leave out cubic, we've left out what it would take for that to be intelligibly the role of the color word. The descriptions yielded by the abstraction. Now, this is me quoting you, quoting me, right? Bottom of page 12 and on to page 13. The descriptions yielded by the abstraction omit the context that would be needed if the colors they mention, as in, right, sensation of red, were to be figuring in them, these descriptions, as apparent qualities of external objects.
Well,
so they're not figuring as that, and that's how these specifications arrived at by abstraction, which are still specifications of experiencing, don't contain material to fix it, but the mentions of sensibles that figure in them after this whole are mentions of sensibles in view in these descriptions as perceived or ostensibly perceived, to characterize perceived or ostensibly perceived things. I'm sorry, that's just...
There's another thing, Matt?
Well, this is, I'm not advocating for this, but just to advance the conversation, I think. I mean, so, I mean, if I engage in this process of abstraction, you know, I try to focus on the, you know, sensory aspect of color perception. I can introduce by analogy a word for attribute of a sensation, you know, a sensation of red. And now you might think that it's equally attractive to think that I can introduce by analogy some spatial language to characterize it. So I mean, that red in the its shape in the visual field or whatever, you know.
Right, because it isn't. This is a thing to say instead of the idea that we need to introduce properties of sensations, which is why when Bill accuses me of trying to make room for sensations to be coloured, I'm not doing that.
Right.
The way the colour words function in sensation of red is as words for a certain visible property of some things, a property that some things can be seen to have. That's all. That's the only significance that red has. Something starting with a perceiving or ostensible perceiving, that something has that property, and leaving out a bunch, we can get to a specification that's still of that same thing, where this specification does not contain enough to fix it, that what the colour word is doing in there is introducing a visible quality, a quality seen or ostensibly seen to characterize some seen or ostensibly seen thing. Yeah, no, and then that's my shot at saying, so here we have by Jim's top-down abstraction move, a specification. It's important that it still is a specification of the experiencing, the whole shebang, right? But such that the thing is now in view as conforming to Kant's characterization of sensations.
Yeah.
So no analogical. It's the very thing. So the presupposition of your question was, why not introduce analogical shape concepts? I'm not in the business of introducing analogical concepts. I have to leave out the shape concepts because I'm working within the scope of a thing that Sellars finds in Kant and complains about, that spatial concepts characterize how things are perceived to and Sellars says he ought to be thinking of spatiality as a form of sensibility as such, but this is thinking of spatiality as a form of sensibility informed by the understanding. So I'm saying, yeah, that is how Kant conceives of spatiality in the end when you think things through. We don't need a form of sensibility as such as well. But still, we can get into kind of non-null specifications by an abstraction of what are in fact perceivings or ostensible perceivings. That we can recognize as specifications of sensations in Kant's sense. We probably shouldn't talk of sensations as if they were seriously thingy. Capturings of the sensory aspect in a way that lines up with what Kant says the products of sensibility are.
Right. No, I mean, mainly I just wanted to bring out this difference. I mean, but
that's what I wanted to bring out.
I mean, could you say a bit more about why space drops out in that? But you know, greenness doesn't. In this process of abstraction, we set aside space.
Here's a sort of roughly Kantian thing to say. Space is the form of outer sense. Sellars complains. The question is whether it's a complaint, but he's right about what he poses as a complaint. All Kant gives us to mean by that is space is the form of outer sense informed by the understanding. Jim are you going to help?
Well, I mean, I think it should be put something like this, isn't it? It's like when Kant gets around to talking in detail about the thing he calls the form of outer sense, it turns out to be space. And space turns out to be, if we think about it carefully, only the form of something which is informed by the understanding. Therefore, there's something Kant should have been meant to be talking about, which is the form of sensibility as such, which he's actually failed to talk about. I mean, something like that is, I think, the way Sellars thinks about it.
So, but anyway, the thing is that the role of Q in the starting point, right, intuition of a translucent pink cube, belongs there. That's a spatial concept, sure. The spatiality that there is in that use of that spatial concept is not the spatiality that Sellars complains that Kant doesn't elaborate. That's the spatiality that he complains that Kant exclusively focuses on. So if you want a specification of what is in fact that item, an intuition of a translucent pink cube, that stands a chance of describing it as a mere modification of the subject state, which is supposed to exclude Brentano intentionality. Yeah? You've got to leave cube out of what you say it's of. And that consideration does not apply to pink and translucent.
One final finger, Mark? No?
It's time.
Okay. Then I guess it's time to close the session. And let's thank Bill.
Just one more session. That's hold on. I wanted to say to John, Sellars is a although I mean it's not altogether wrong about that. With every that John leaves out. I don't know.
I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, and then I mean this part is look. I mean, the tracking that's. But as far as having the view that.
No, I just meant like so. If the idea is,
I'm not.
maybe this idea doesn't work. I mean, for years.